In this video, I'll be talking about triggers and other elements that help us monitor the risk and determine the responses appropriated for the risks. So it is important to understand that a trigger doesn't mark the start of a risk. It marks the start of the risk response. So a trigger triggers the risk response. It's a signal that indicates a risk is no longer a risk. It's now a certain event. So as we look at this diagram here, we'll see that before the trigger happens, we will be focusing on preventing the risk. But after this has happened, then we can only recover from it. So the important thing here is, again, to understand and keep in mind that the trigger focuses on the risk response, not on the risk itself. Now, what is a contingency? A contingency plan or a contingency response strategy are the actions that we have to take in order to recover from the trigger after the trigger has happened. So they will be dependent on a specific trigger. This is essentially our plan B. Now we have contingency reserve as well, which is an amount of funds, budget, money, time above and beyond what we currently have in the project plan in order to deal with the cost overruns and delays in the project as a result of accepting risks and or unknown risks. As we have defined risks in terms of an uncertain event that has a positive or a negative impact, we need to talk about the responses for positive risks as well, or opportunities. So the responses for positive risks include exploitation, which means let's make sure that the risk will happen and we will take advantage of that opportunity. Sharing, which means if we cannot make the risk happen or the opportunity happen in the project, then we will share that risk or positive risk with another party who can make sure that the risk can happen. And of course, I keep using the term risk here, and I mean the risk in a positive sense, the positive risk, the opportunity. The third strategy is enhancing, which is really the opposite of mitigation. So in terms of enhancing, we will be looking into improving the probability or impact of the positive risk. And then there's acceptance. If there's nothing we can do for the positive risk, we will be just focusing on accepting that particular risk. So there are other things in terms of risk response strategies that we have to take into account. So for every risk, we should have multiple plans in place. There is the primary strategy, but there should be a secondary or a fallback plan should the first and primary strategy fail. Also, we need to remember, as we mentioned before, there are secondary risks. When we have a strategy in place, that could actually introduce a new risk. And then there is contingency reserve that we always should have in place, of course, with good justification for the amount of the time or cost that we are allocating in the contingency reserve. In the risk response planning process, we're going to have a series of outputs, and these outputs include risk register, the related contract decisions, project management plan updates, which we have to look into updating the project plans, updating project documents, as well as the risk response matrix. So what is a risk response matrix? Risk response matrix prioritizes all the risks and compares the responses to the other responses that we have in place. So this is a very good example of that. In this particular example, what we have is, this is from the Kendrick's book, by the way. This is picture 38 from Kendrick's book, Managing Project Risks. Here we have all the responses that we have. So here we have all the risks, and we have the responses for the risks, with the type of impact each response has on each risk. So for instance, this response improves this risk, has a positive impact on this risk. This has a positive impact on two risks and negative impact on two other risks. So if we decide to employ this response, we will need to deal or come up with other strategies for these two. Whereas this one has positive impacts on all these risks. Now, This doesn't mean that these positive impacts will mitigate or avoid these risks completely. We may need multiple responses for a risk. However, this definitely has positive impacts and doesn't have any negative impacts on anything else. So this is a good visual tool that can help us determine what responses we should select and whether or not we should avoid some of the responses.